There is a particular kind of violence that leaves no bruise. It does not announce itself in a courtroom or a headline. It moves through school corridors where a child is handed a doll instead of a hammer, through office doors that open more easily for one voice than another, through the small recurring calculus a woman performs in her head each time she's offered a promotion. Who will pick up the children? Who will manage if I say yes? What will I be seen as if I say no? It is not a single act, it is a grammar. And like all grammar, it operates so far beneath conscious speech that most of us who use it every day could not, if asked, explain its rules. This video is an attempt to make that grammar visible. The aim is not merely academic, it is to leave you, whoever you are, pausing somewhere in the middle of this video to ask a question you had not thought you would ask ever in your life, about who taught you what it means to be a man or a woman, and whether you ever actually agreed to the lesson. Every civilization tells itself a story about why things are the way they are. In the book of Genesis, the story is explicit. Eve tastes the forbidden fruit, and the Lord tells her, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." Sociologists have a name for this kind of story. They call it mythological justification, a narrative that does not describe reality so much as manufacture the appearance that reality could not have been otherwise. The genius of such a story is that it does not feel like an argument. It feels like a fact of nature, arriving with the weather. For most of human history, the sociological discipline that might have interrogated this story was itself complicit in repeating it. Feminist sociologists have given complicitly a name to it: mainstream sociology. Mainstream sociology, as it was actually practiced, overwhelmingly authored by men, about men generalized carelessly into women, and blind to entire continent of human experience: housework, childbirth, unpaid care, that simply never made it into the journals because the men writing them never had to live with them. When women did appear in early sociological research, they often appeared distorted. Female criminals, for instance, were treated by early criminologists as biologically or psychologically anomalous, or the unexplained, unexamined assumption that normal women were naturally passive and law abiding, so that the very existence of female criminal became something requiring special, pathologizing explanation that a male criminal never needed. Feminist scholars offered three different paths out of this inheritance. Some believed in integration, folding feminist insight into existing sociology, correcting it from within. Others argued from separatism, an entirely independent body of knowledge built by and for women, free from mainstream contamination. And some, the most radical among them, called for reconceptualization, not adding women to sociology's existing house, but tearing the house down and rebuilding it from the foundation that could hold everyone's experience from the start. The debate between these three positions is, in a miniature, the debate this whole video will keep circling back to: is inequality something to be corrected within existing structures, or something that requires these structures to be rebuilt? Before we can talk about gender, sociology insists we first separate it from sex. Sex is chromosomal, gonadal, hormonal, the terrain of biology. Gender is the meaning a culture drapes over that terrain, the psychological and social scaffolding of masculinity and femininity. The psychoanalysts Robert Stoller made this distinction with unusual clarity in 1968, noting that the words masculine and feminine carry connotations that might be quite independent of one's biological sex. It sounds almost too obvious to need saying. And yet, an enormous amount of 20th century science was spent trying to make the two categories collapse back into one, trying to prove essentially that gender was simply sex wearing a costume. The attempt failed, and it is worth dwelling on how it failed because the failure is instructive. Consider the hormone. The theory was elegant. Testosterone drives aggression, estrogen drives nurture, and from this chemical asymmetry, the entire edifice of masculine dominance and feminine deference could supposedly be derived. But when researchers actually tracked testosterone levels in adolescent boys over 3 years, they found something inconvenient. Testosterone rose sharply while aggression did not rise to match it. The correlation the theory required simply was not there. What did correlate with aggression, researchers found, was something far less biological, a pure culture's obsession with reputation and honor. Hormones might set the stage, but culture wrote the script, performed on it. Later, meta-analysis studies that pool the findings of many smaller studies to see what survives scrutiny found that personality differences between men and women are, in the sociologist's Connell's words, not fixed constants but varying products of the active responses people make to the complex and changing social world. Consider the brain. For decades, popular science insisted men and women's brain were lateralized differently. That the left hemisphere language centers and the right hemisphere's spatial reasoning were distributed unequally by sex, explaining why boys were supposedly better at maths and girls at language. The evidence for this painstakingly gathered through neuroimaging technologies that could not actually measure brain activity directly, only infer it crudely from the blood flow, simply dissolved under closer inspection. Large meta-analysis found no statistically significant lateralization differences at all. The biologists Anne Foster Sterling, examining the supposed sex differences in the corpus callosum, the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, concluded the structure was too complex, too irregular, too poorly understood, even in principle, to support the sweeping claims built on top of it. And consider sociobiology, perhaps the most seductive of all these biological arguments, because it dressed itself in the authority of Darwin. Its logic: men produce millions of sperms across a lifetime, women a mere few hundred eggs, each pregnancy costly. Therefore, it is adaptive for men to be promiscuous and women to be choosy, for men to compete and women to nurture. It is a theory almost perfectly designed to explain and thereby excuse exactly the behavior it describes. But cross-cultural anthropology quietly demolishes it. Societies exist in which women openly initiate sexual relationships, in which female apes fight, forage, and form alliances against aggressive males, in which the entire coy female, competitive male script simply does not appear. The sociologist John Nicholson gave this pattern a reasoning, a precise and damning name: the naturalistic fallacy. The slide from this is natural, to this is therefore right, fixed, and beyond challenge. It is not coincidentally one of the oldest tricks power has ever used to secure itself, convince the subordinate that their subordination is simply how the world is built. None of this means biology is irrelevant. A body that menstruates, gestates, and lactates is not a blank page, but it does mean something more precise and more radical. biology sets possibilities, not scripts. The gap between what a body can do and what a society insists it must do is exactly the space where gender inequality lives. And the anthropologist George Peter, surveying around 224 societies in 1949, seemed to confirm as much when he found men and women labor divided along broadly similar lines nearly everywhere. Until Anne Oakley went back to him with own data set and found the pygmies sharing childcare equally, and the Tasmanian Aboriginal women fishing and hunting seals, women laboring in mines across parts of Asia and Latin America, and women serving in the armed forces of USSR, China, Cuba, and Israel. The universal division of labor turned out to be considerably less universal than the theory required. Oakley's own verdict remains one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the sociology of gender. There is no reason why the division of labor by sex should exist at all. And if biology cannot explain gender inequality, sociology must ask a harder question. Where did it come from? Not metaphysically, but historically. And at what point and through what mechanism did societies begin sorting human beings into a hierarchy on the basis of sex? Four thinkers offer four different origin stories, and it is worth sitting with all of the four, because each one locates the wound in different place. And where you believe the wound began shapes what you believe the cure must be. Beginning with Shulamith Firestone, who locates it in the body itself, not as biological destiny, but as biological disadvantage, historically exploited. Pregnancy, birth, and the long dependency of the human infant made women vulnerable, and men, she argues, built the earliest systems of stratification, the sexual class system, directly out of this vulnerability, using it as the template for every later hierarchy, class, race, empire. Her prescribed remedy is almost science fictional in its radicalism. Only by moving reproduction outside the body entirely, she believed, could women be freed from the material root of their dependency. Coming on to Sherry Ortner, who locates it not in biology directly, but in what culture does with biology's associations. Every known culture, she observed, ranks culture above nature, control above the wild, and deliberate above the given. And because menstruation, pregnancy, nursing tie women more visibly to processes of body, women become symbolically twined with nature and thereby devalued in the hierarchy that was never really about biology so much as about which side of a metaphor one gets placed on. The next was Michelle Rosaldo, who locates it in geography. Not literally geography, but the geography of social life, split between domestic sphere and public sphere. Freed from the domestic, men accumulates the kind of power that only the public sphere can confer, political, religious, economic, while women's labor, however essential, remains locally confined and therefore structurally invisible to the machinery of status. The last, but of course not the least, was Frederick Engels, writing The Marxist Collaborator in 1884, with imperfect anthropological evidence, but a genuinely pioneering instinct, locates it in property. In the earliest societies, he argued, there was no female subordination worth the name. Property was rudimentary and passed through the maternal line because paternity itself could not be reliably known under the communal sexual arrangement. The rupture came with the domestication of livestock, the first real accumulation of wealth, and with it a new male anxiety. Whose children are these, and will my wealth pass to them? The answer was monogamous marriage, a mechanism for guaranteeing paternity by restricting a woman's sexual autonomy, and with it, Engels argued, the birth of the patriarchal family. The moment, in his own unsparing phrase, the women became instruments for breeding children rather than partners in production. You will notice something remarkable if you set these four theories side by side. None of them agree, and yet none of them are simply wrong. Firestone's biology, Ochner's symbolism, Rosaldo's geography of spheres, and Engel's property each captures a real thread in a rope that no single strand can fully account for. This is, in fact, the deeper lesson of this whole video. Gender inequality was never caused by one thing. It is overdetermined, held in place simultaneously by biology's raw material, by culture's symbolic coding, by spatial organization of labor, and by the economics of property and inheritance. To dismantle it, in other words, is not a matter of pulling one thread. It requires understanding how many different mechanisms are quietly cooperating, often without any single person intending it, to keep the whole structure standing. And if there is one concept that tries to name the whole structure at once, it is patriarchy. A word that, depending on who is using it, can mean anything, from the rule of fathers in its narrowest sense to an entire self-sustaining system in which men as a group hold structural power over women as a group. Kate Millett, writing in 1970, gave the word its modern sociological teeth. Politics, she argued, is not confined to parliaments. It exists whenever one group exercises power over another, including and especially in the bedroom and the kitchen. She identified 8 interlocking pillars propping patriarchy up. Biology, a small part. Ideology, the socialization of aggression in boys and passivity in girls. The family, patriarchy's primary transmission mechanism across generations. The caste-like status obscured by the ideology of romantic love, economic dependency, religion, and internalized psychology of female deference, and underwriting it all, the ever-present possibility of physical force. But Millett's picture, powerful as it is, was also criticized for being too total, too static, a portrait of patriarchy as eternal, almost weatherless fact. When history shows patriarchy has actually taken remarkably different shapes across time. It is here that Sylvia Walby's work becomes indispensable, because Walby did something genuinely important. She historized patriarchy without dissolving it. Walby's argument, distilled to its essence, is this. In the same 19th century, patriarchy was private. An individual patriarch, husband, father, controlled his women directly within a household from which women were largely excluded from the wider public world altogether. Barred from most employment, from politics, from institutions of power. But over the 20th century, patriarchy did not disappear. It changed address. It became public. Women gained formal access to work, to politics, to public life. The doors were no longer locked. But once inside, women found themselves segregated into lower paid, lower status corners of that public world, exploited now not by one man in one household, but collectively by the structure of employment, the state, the culture as the whole. Her work distills this beautifully. The mode of expropriation shifts from individual to collective. The patriarchal strategy shifts from exclusionary to segregationist. Women were not liberated from patriarchy in the 20th century. They were, in Walby's careful phrase, relocated within it. This is not a smaller point. It is worth sitting with, because it explains something that otherwise looks like a paradox. How can a society pass equal pay legislation, elect women to parliament, open its universities and professions to women, and still remain, by any honest measure, unequal? Walby's answer is that formal, legal exclusion was never the only mechanism patriarchy had available to it. When the front door was forced open, the house simply rearranged its interior. This is precisely why Anna Pollard's sharp critique of the concept of patriarchy, that it risks being used circularly, both to describe inequality and to explain in the same breath, deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away. A concept that cannot specify its own mechanism of changes is, in the end, only a half theory. Wolbey's later work responds to exactly this challenge by shifting towards the language of gender regimes, distinguishing, for instance, between neoliberal regimes, that is, free market, minimal welfare, high female employment, but on poor terms, and social democratic regimes, strong public childcare, more genuinely enabling conditions for women's paid work. A vocabulary that lets us ask concretely which political economics arrangement makes women's life materially better rather than simply naming the problem and stopping there. Okay, so if it's not the body, then what exactly it is? It is here this video is going to take a philosophically vertiginous turn. So far, the argument has been sex is biological, gender is social, and the second has been wrongly naturalized as an extension of the first. But a further, more radical question waits underneath. That one is even sex itself, the supposedly solid biological floor beneath all this social scaffolding, actually as solid as we assume? The evidence suggests, unsettlingly, that it is not. Some women carry high androgen levels, some men carry low ones. Individuals with Turner syndrome possess single X chromosome and a female appearance, yet can fail chromosomal sex verification tests. Women's athletics. Intersex individuals are born with both male and female physical characteristics. Some societies have long recognized a third gender role entirely. The Native American Burdick being one well-documented example, treating the binary not as a law of nature, but as one cultural convention among several possible ones. The sociologists Kessler and Wendy McKenna, studying how ordinary people actually decide whether someone in front of them is a male or a female, found that this decision is made almost entirely through social cues: speech, appearance, biographical narrative, and only very rarely, even if through direct inspection of the body itself. Anne Foster Sterling pushed the implication further still, arguing openly that our two-sex system is a social decision dressed as a biological given, and that surgically forcing intersex infants into one category or the other, a routine medical practice for much of the 20th century, inflicts real harm in service of binary that nature itself does not insist upon. Her case study of the Spanish hurdler Maria Patino, disqualified from the 1988 Olympics after a chromosome test revealed a Y chromosome she carried due to androgen insensitivity. Despite having lived her entire life and developed her entire body an unambiguously female, remains one of the most vivid illustrations available of how thin, how administratively enforced the line between male and female really is at its edges. It is against this backdrop that Judith Butler's theory of performativity makes it full sense. Butler's claim is not simply that gender is learned, rather than innate. Oakley had already established that much through socialization theory. Butler's claim is more unsettling, that gender is not something you have at all, expressed outward through behavior, but something produced by the very act of repeated behavior, a stylized repetition of acts that, through sheer accumulation, generates the illusion of a stable, essential interior identity where none exists prior to performance. There is no true self underneath the performance waiting to be expressed. The performance is, in an important sense, all there is, which means crucially that the performance can also be refused, disrupted, played differently. Butler calls these refusals subversive bodily acts and points to transsexual and transgender lives as living proof that the supposedly natural correspondence between body, desire, and identity can be and constantly is rearranged. It would be easy to treat this as an abstract philosophical curiosity, safely quarantined in gender studies seminar rooms. It is not. If gender is performance rather than essence, then every place that seemed to require rigid gender performance, the boardroom that expects assertiveness from men and warmth from women, the household that assigns caregiving as though it were instinctive rather than assigned, it revealed as a stage set, not the law of nature. That is either terrifying or liberating. Depending on where you are standing, it is usually both. Let us now come to the part where economists and sociologists studying labor markets across dozens of countries have converged on a finding sturdy enough to have earned its own name: the motherhood penalty. It is distinct from and remarkably now accounts for most of the broader gender pay gap. Recent research finds that in the United States, mothers earned roughly 64 cents for every dollar earned by fathers in 2025, when all workers are counted, rising to about 74 cents among those working full-time year-round, a gap that widens further, not narrows, as women progress through their careers and have more children. One recent analysis found that a single child under the age of 5 can reduce a mother's earnings by as much as 15%, and that across a working lifetime, women who become mothers early rather than delaying motherhood can end up earning several $100,000 less over 30 years. Even after controlling for education and hours worked, the wage loss traced not to lower productivity but overwhelmingly to disrupted career continuity. The missed promotion cycle, the stalled network, the years of experience that simply do not accumulate, while a woman is, quite literally, keeping another human being alive. What is striking, and this is precisely where the theory earlier in this video earns its keep, is that fathers do not experience the mirror image of this penalty. Several major studies now find something closer to fatherhood bonus. Men's earnings, if anything, rise modestly after becoming parents, seemingly because fatherhood signals stability and commitment to employers, while motherhood, for reasons no economic model has ever needed, signals the opposite: a presumed and unrequested divided loyalty. One large 2024 survey of pay data found that when women identified as a parent or primary caregiver, they faced an uncontrolled pay gap of 75% to the male parent dollar. Even once every measurable variable, hours, role, seniority, is statistically controlled for, mothers still earned only 98 cents to the equivalent father's dollar. Motherhood, in other words, is treated by labor markets not as a neutral biological fact, but as something closer to a liability disclosed on the resume, even when the mother is in the room by every measurable output, exactly as capable as a childless colleague beside her. Now, place this alongside everything the earlier sections of this video have already established, and the motherhood penalty stops looking like an isolated economic quirk and starts looking exactly like what Talcott Parsons described in cooler and more approving language 70 years ago: the expressive role, quietly still assigned to women as the natural complement to men's instrumental breadwinning, except now dressed in the neutral, bloodless language of flexibility, commitment, and cultural fit, rather than openly declared as ideology the way Parson declared it. Human capital theory tells employers this penalty is rational. Women anticipate career breaks, so it is efficient to invest less in training them, pay them less, promote them less. But Anvit's rebuttal from decades earlier still stands and still lands with full force today. Even women who never take career breaks, who works continuously and without interruptions, still end up disproportionately in lower paid, lower status roles. The penalty, in other words, does not track actual disruption. It tracks the mere fact of being a woman presumed likely to become or already having become a mother. Precisely the kind of structural anticipatory discrimination that no amount of individual effort can outwork. This is also exactly where Walby's shift from private to public patriarchy becomes suddenly not an abstract historical thesis, but a description of a lived Tuesday morning. No employer today would say aloud that a woman's place is in the home. The doors of the office are formally wide open, but the architecture inside, the unpaid, unequal division of domestic labor that research still consistently finds falls disproportionately on women, even when both partners work full time. The long hour cultures, the presenteeism, and the UK's own Women in Work Commission identified as structurally penalising anyone who cannot be seen as a desk past six. The subtle recalibration of women's perceived commitment the moment she becomes visibly pregnant, all of this constitutes precisely collective segregationists' mode of patriarchal exploitation, Walby described. Operating without a single individual patriarch needing to issue a single command. Nobody has to decide to penalize mothers. The system does it automatically, the way water finds its level. And it is worth naming too what this costs beyond the individual paycheck. It costs organizations the leadership of half of their most capable people. It costs societies fertility itself. Researchers increasingly link falling birth rates in wealthy countries directly to the unequal burden of care work that makes motherhood an ambition feel to many women like a choice between two forms of self erasure rather than a compatible pair. And it costs something harder to quantify the quiet, corrosive lesson absorbed by every daughter watching her mother make this calculation, and every son watching his father remain exempt from it. A lesson about whose time is negotiable and whose is not, passed down not through any single conversation, but through the accumulated weight of 1,000 ordinary evenings. It is going to be a serious incompleteness and frankly a betrayal of the video's own final and most quietly important move. To end this video, as though gender theory only ever asks what has been done to women. For most of sociology's history, men were the unmarked category, studied constantly but never as men, never understood as gendered subjects at all, simply treated as the neutral background against which women's differences was measured. R. W. Cornell's work on masculinities corrects this, and in doing so, offers perhaps the most useful concept in the entire video for understanding how gender inequality actually reproduces itself. Hegemonic masculinity, the particular historically specific version of manhood that claims at any given moment the dominant position over both women and others, subordinated masculinities. Cornell's genuinely elegant insight is that hegemonic masculinity does not require men to actually embody it. Most men live in a state of complicity with it, benefiting from its dividends. The assumption of competence, the presumption of authority, the freedom from the motherhood penalty's mirror image, without personally enacting its most extreme aggressive forms. And crucially, hegemonic masculinity is never secure. It requires constant active maintenance through a vocabulary of ridicule aimed at any man who deviates from it, through the historical criminalization of homosexuality, through the association of masculinity with rationality and the corresponding devaluation of emotion, that the theorist Victor Schiedler traced back to the Enlightenment's own founding split between cold, controlling reason and everything coded as feminine, embodied, and irrational. This matters enormously for the video's central argument because it reveals that patriarchy is not simply a system that benefits men as an undifferentiated, satisfied block. Cornell's own interviews with Australian men found genuine anguish inside the structure. Working class men performing an exaggerated, sometimes a violent masculinity as compensation for economic exclusion. Men in environmental movement carrying real guilt about how men had historically treated women. Gay men holding and sometimes struggling against remarkably conventional ideas about masculinity, even while rejecting compulsory heterosexuality. Professional men experiencing genuine emotional crisis when a woman, a sister, a boss held authority over them in a way their own socialization has never prepared them to accept gracefully. The cage, in other words, has more than one occupant. It simply locks from different sides. We began with an image of a violence that leaves no bruise, a grammar so deeply learned that most of us cannot see the moment we learned it. It is worth returning at the end to that image because the entire architecture surveyed in this video, the failed biology, the competing origin stories, the shift from private to public patriarchy, and the destabilized body, the motherhood penality operating in silence in ordinary offices, the cage that also confines men presumed to hold its keys, point towards one final, uncomfortable, and genuinely liberating idea. If gender inequality was purely biological, there would be nothing to be done about it, and nothing to feel except a kind of resignation. If it was purely a matter of individual prejudice, one bad manager, one biased selection committee, it would be a problem of ethics solvable through good intentions and better hiring policy. But the evidence assembled across a century of research since points somewhere else entirely, towards a structure built brick by brick out of hormonal theories that did not survive scrutiny. Symbolic associations between women and nature that no one consciously chose, property systems that quietly required paternity certainty, labor markets that reward the appearance of undivided commitment over its substance, and a masculinity so anxious about its own naturalness that it has needed policing centuries after century, precisely because it was never natural at all. Structures, unlike facts of nature, can be redesigned. That is the entire quietly radical promise buried inside the video that otherwise looks like a dry catalogue of theorists and dates. Anne Oakley, closing her own late, most global work, put it starkly. Unless the gender systems changes, she warned, humanity risks missing the opportunity to make its next few billions years on this planet better for everyone. For the planet and for us, this is not a small claim, and she did not mean it as a hyperbole. She meant that the same logic which taught a boy that his worth lies in detached rational control, and taught a girl that her worth lies in an unpaid invisible labor of care, is the same logic that has taught an entire civilization to treat the natural world the way it has long treated women, as a resource to be managed rather than a partner to be reckoned with. So here at the end is the question this video leaves you with. The one it hopes you will not simply read past or hear past. Somewhere in your life, in the way you were praised as a child, in the career choice that felt like your own idea but was quietly narrowed for you years before you were old enough to notice the narrowing, in the assumption you carry about who in a relationship should adjust their ambitions when a child arrives. There is a piece of this architecture installed before you, had the tools to evaluate it, functioning exactly as designed. The invitation of sociology, as its best, is not to make you feel guilty for having lived inside a structure you did not build. It is simply to hand you the blueprint and to ask gently but insistently, now that you can see the walls, do you still agree with where they were placed?